I'm Tom Douglas, Director of Research at the Oxford Uehiro Centre, and I'll be chairing this third lecture. So welcome to the third and final of Professor Tom Hurka's Oxford Uehiro Lectures on Knowledge and Achievement. And thanks for joining us, and thanks especially to those of you who have managed to make it to all three of the lectures. I think we might have a slightly smaller crowd than we had on Monday, but I think I'm also right in saying that we usually have a much faster rate of drop-off than this, and so you've achieved something significant in such a low rate of fall of attendance. And I think also that's good evidence that many people have been finding these lectures highly compelling. So I'm going to let Tom introduce the topic of the lecture and how it relates to what came before, but let me just mention that the sort of logistical arrangements will be the same as for the previous two lectures. So we'll have, Tom will speak for about 55 to 60 minutes. Then we'll have just 1 or 2 minutes for anyone who needs to leave to do so. And then we'll have some discussion that can go until 6:15 tonight. But we do again need to finish promptly so that Tom can be whisked off to another dinner. Okay, so I'm sure we'll be pressed for time when it comes to the discussion. So let me, without any further delay, hand over to Professor Tom Hurka for his third and final lecture. Thank you.
I should say thanks again to the Center for the invitation. This has been an exciting and fruitful week, and thanks to you for not being so much diminishing marginal attendance in subsequent lectures. Okay, so my first lecture proposed an account of the intrinsic goods of perfection, the intrinsic perfectionist goods of knowledge and achievement as such or in general. The second added an account of degrees of value in these goods, or for what makes some truths more worth knowing than others, and some goals more worth achieving. Its core was a value for both goods of generality, understood as having two forms that I called intrinsic and relative generality. In this third lecture, I'm going to try to draw some applied ethics conclusions from these goods, especially given that account of degrees in their value. So what in particular follows for social policy or for how governments should act from the view that there's value in intrinsically and relatively general knowledge and achievement? Now, perfectionist values like these two are sometimes thought to bear mainly on self-regarding choices, ones about what you should seek in your own life. But they also have implications for social and political questions. Aristotle thought the proper aim of the state is the eudaimonia, or the living of objectively good lives by all citizens. More recently, G.E. Moore, Hastings Rational, L.T. Hobhouse, and others of their era included perfectionist goods in a standard consequentialist view that tells both individuals and governments to aim at the greatest aggregate good of all. Now, these views are all excluded by the influential strand in recent political philosophy initiated by John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin that requires the state to be constrained by a demand of liberal neutrality or public reason, and so never to have as this justification for acting that some activities are intrinsically better than others. In what follows, however, I'm going to ignore all such neutralist demands. The arguments for them have, to my mind at least, repeatedly been exposed as unpersuasive, and the persistence in the literature is frankly a puzzle. So I'm going to ask with no hesitation or embarrassment what follows for social policy from the two perfectionist goods I've described. Now, neutralists and liberals more generally are especially troubled by the prospect of a perfectionist state trying to force people into objectively good activities, for example, through coercive legislation. And that's in principle possible for the goods of knowledge and achievement. A state could require adults to take exams in general or other knowledge and imprison those who did badly. It could also penalize people who fail to complete difficult activities. But like many other writers, I'm going to assume that at least as regards adults, the state will limit its perfectionist policies to ones that non-coercively promote the good. A directive to promote knowledge and achievement needn't, after all, be the only one a state faces. It may also be subject to deontological constraints, such as one based on a right all adults have to choose their own course of life, constraints that make any coercive interference with them, whether by individuals or by a government, other things equal seriously wrong. Efforts to force people into knowledge or achievement may also be blocked by their effects on other goods, either non-perfectionist, such as pleasure or satisfaction, or perfectionist. In the second lecture, I mentioned moral virtue as a separate perfectionist good, and said it involves seeking intrinsically good things in themselves or for their own sakes. But using the coercive power of the law to promote objective goods introduces a motive, the desire to avoid punishment, that's contrary to and could supplant this virtuous one. It may then be, on balance, less good if citizens pursue better knowledge or achievement only in order to avoid punishment than if they pursue some lesser good for its own sake and thus virtuously. A perfectionist view can also treat autonomous self-direction as itself an objective good that coercive action, state action sets back, and can even treat it as an aspect of the good of achievement where you yourself form and realize your life goals. And actually that came up in the Q&A after the last lecture. I mean, I consider the view that there's special value in having knowledge of yourself and achieving goals inside your own life, and achieving goals inside your own life, and particularly the valuable organizing ones, that's a matter of autonomous self-direction. So there are several reasons why a view on which knowledge and achievement are intrinsic goods can resist the use of coercive means to promote them. But these reasons don't have the same force against non-coercive support of the same goods, even though neutralism does object in the same way to that. There are several policy areas where non-coercive promotion of knowledge and achievement is possible and can be, on balance, justified. Actually first, a kind of more abstract topic. It's now 45 years ago, but Thomas Nagel once argued that perfectionist values have a distinctive formal structure, one concerned only with their level and not their spread. We care, he said, that someone has, for example, proved Fermat's last theorem, knows some fact about Roman history, or has walked on the moon, but we don't care that others do the same, or don't care as much that others do the same or repeat the feat. As he put it, quote, it's important to achieve fundamental advances, for example, in mathematics or astronomy, even if very few people come to understand them and they have no practical effects. The mere existence of such understanding somewhere in the species is regarded by many as worth substantial sacrifices. Any such advance will be made by some individual. It was a particular mathematician who proved Fermat's last theorem, but Nagel was right to locate its value on the view he describes in the human species as a whole. Once one person has made an advance, the species has made it and will not have made it any more if someone else repeats it. Nor does it matter which individual makes the advance. What's important is just that someone does. Neil Armstrong understood this when, walking out on the moon, he spoke of, famously, one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. I think Nagel was also right that this view is distinctively suited to perfectionist values. It would be odd to care in the same way that someone somewhere has enjoyed a particular intense pleasure or fulfilled some unusual desire. With these values, we seem to care only about their spread. But it's too much to suggest, as Nagel did, that this is the only view appropriate for perfectionist values. As I've said, many perfectionists have cared that everyone lead an objectively good life, and that has been and should be the principal perfectionist view. Still, there can be, as an addition with some weight, the species-centered concern that someone somewhere achieve a perfectionist good. So humanity as a whole achieve it, but doesn't matter to the same degree that the achievement is widely shared. There can also be a variant of this view on which for any nation or community, it matters that some member of it has done some unique research or achieved some special goal, so the nation as a whole has done it. In either form, the view can have some policy implications. So under the heading of knowledge, it can favor the use of public funds to support research, for example, at universities. So some people, even if not many, know a proof of Fermat's theorem or facts about Roman history. The aim is just that this knowledge exists somewhere in the species or the community. Though it may be enough in principle on this view that one person knows some fact, this usually won't be possible unless there's a body of researchers at different universities who support each other's efforts, and of course different researchers can know different things. So in practice, the view favors supporting a cohort of researchers, even though formally it gives no weight to numbers. You know, for one person to have some knowledge, usually several must have it. The same policy can be favored under the heading of achievement, namely that of discovering, by complex and challenging means, the truth on some topic. Thus, it can matter that humanity as a whole has successfully proved Fermat's theorem or done all the work involved in confirming the existence of the Higgs boson, given how difficult that is, or arrived at some hard-to-reach understanding. There can be a similar justification for supporting from public funds experimental work in the arts that has a limited audience, or the achievements of Olympic athletes who set records, or of astronauts who walk on the moon. Of course, there can be other justifications of policies like these. University faculty who are active in research may be better teachers and impart more knowledge to their students. Discoveries in what seem arcane branches of physics can have technological spin-offs, and what was once experimental art can come to be widely appreciated. Moreover, the actual motives behind such policies have been pursued may not have been all that perfectionist. Thus, the U.S. space program of the 1960s was motivated in large part by nationalism, military interest, and the perceived demands of the Cold War. But a perfectionism focused in Nagel's way on unique goods attributable to humanity as a whole can give an additional justification for funding programs that support these goods, even if the goods won't be shared by many people. A broadly perfectionist view needn't include a part with this distinctive structure. Doesn't have to include a part with that distinctive structure. It can instead care only, as Moore and Rashdall did, about the total good in all people's lives. And even if it does include such a part, it needn't give it great weight against the total good. Still, including it is one option and can make perfectionism distinctively favor public support for individual excellences or superlative instances of knowledge and achievement as goods of humanity apart from their wider appeal. Actually, when we were sitting before, Tom said, are you going to give a justification for funding philosophy? That requires that philosophy arrives at knowledge. Well, we believe it. Okay. Next topic. The perfectionist policy that's figured most in discussions of liberal neutrality is government funding of the arts. So it can have Nagel's rationale if it aims to ensure that a certain type of art or its appreciation exists just somewhere, and some may take this view about, say, contemporary classical music. And the idea that classical, I don't mean Mozart, I mean the stuff that people compose today. Our neighbors in Toronto are a contemporary classical composer and director, and I think they think that arts funding should ensure that their type of music still continues. Well, that's kind of a Nagel-like justification of government support for the arts. But its more common form involves subsidizing museums, orchestras, and theater companies so they can have lower ticket prices and attract more visitors. Its main justification, then, is to make an intrinsic good of aesthetic appreciation available to more people more often. There are, however, different views of what this good is, and so different forms the justification can take. On one view, G.E. Moore, for example, the relevant good is that of appreciating beauty, where beauty can't be given an informative analysis, and there's no common feature that makes all beautiful things beautiful. But on other views, the good is cognitive or involves some kind of knowledge. Thus, some think literature gives us insights into human psychology through the characters it portrays, or that the arts more generally expose us to, and so teach us about, different ways of seeing the world. For some, art conveys philosophical understanding or expresses abstract truths, while others think it gives us more specifically moral knowledge, and even that exposure to it can make us morally better people. A perfectionist justification of government arts funding will be different given a different one of these views, but there's a specific count of aesthetic value that fits the generality measures, intrinsic and relative generality, that I've proposed. So this view says the beauty or aesthetic value, if that's distinct from beauty, of a successful work of art, depends on the relations between its elements, and more specifically, on its unifying diverse elements in a way that makes for unity in diversity, or what's often called, within aesthetics, organic unity. That's a familiar phrase from these lectures, but it's used in a kind of different way, related way, but a different way in aesthetics. In a painting, these elements are lines, colors, and other compositional features, as well as in a representational work, its subject matter. In music, they're notes at a time in a chord, through time in a melody, or both in a whole composition. In a novel or play, they're words, descriptions, and especially incidents of plot. But in all these cases, different elements are combined in a way that creates an overall emotional or aesthetic effect. Where that effect and its creation are what has aesthetic value. So a work's elements can also include its theme, for example, the philosophical idea it aims to illustrate or express. If there's harmony between this idea and the way it's expressed, or between the work's content and its form, that can be another source of aesthetic value. But the general idea is that a work's aesthetic value rests on unifying relations among, in the ideal case, diverse elements. Unlike some accounts of aesthetic value, this one fits many and even all the arts. For example, all of painting, music, poetry, and drama. In all these arts, it holds, there's more aesthetic worth, both when a work is more thoroughly unified and when the elements it unifies are more diverse. That last bit is sort of from Robert Nozick's Philosophical Explanations, a brief discussion about art. And the little I've read, I think kind of organic unity is the ground of aesthetic worth, goes back to Coleridge. He's apparently the person who introduced it. In any case, it's typically assumed that this unity and diversity is especially present in works of art as against in other beautiful objects. So these works are especially worthy objects of appreciation, and that appreciation is especially worth promoting, for example, through government subsidies. So there's a clear overlap between this view and the generality measures in my second lecture. Appreciating a work with this kind of organic unity involves a mental state with first intrinsic generality. If you have to take in the work and its many elements as a single unit in order to appreciate it fully, as you clearly do. Thus you have to take in as one unit a whole melody, all of a painting, and at least the main lines of a novel's plot. The appreciation also involves, as or even more importantly, relative generality, if you have to see how those elements, especially if they're diverse, combine to create their common aesthetic effect. You have to see the organic relations. There are, however, different ways of doing this. In some cases, you grasp the overall aesthetic property a work's unity makes for without fully or consciously understanding how its elements generate that property. Thus, you may see that a work has a certain kind of beauty or expresses a certain emotion, but be unable to say exactly which of its features make that so. So I've always found that, the famous Philip Larkin lines, they fuck you up, your mom and dad, they may not mean to, but they do. Despite despite their informal vocabulary, distinctively poetic and even elevated. I mean, I don't know, does anyone else feel this? They just sound poetic to me. This rests on several features. So first of all, the regular iambic rhythm, the internal rhyme of the short U sounds in the first line. There's 3 of them. And the alliterations, first of the M and then of the D, starting each line's final word. In hearing the lines as poetic, you have to, in some sense, be hearing these elements. But you typically aren't conscious of some of them. Do you notice the 2 Ds at the last words in the last word of each line? Nor of the way they together create the poetic tone. Much of their effect on you is subconscious. You can likewise hear a 1960s soul music recording, say from the Stack Studio in Memphis, as loose and funky, but not be aware that this results in part from a delayed backbeat where the rhythm section is slightly late on the second beat of each bar. If you're asked what makes the recording funky, you can't say, though you must at some level be hearing the delay. In each of these cases, these may be bad examples, but do you get the idea that you can listen to a work of art and notice an aesthetic effect or an emotional feeling or something like that, and it's created by the way the elements in the work relate to each other, but you're not consciously aware of the way they do that. In each of these cases, critical analysis, either literary or musical, can reveal more about how the work's elements combine to produce their aesthetic effect. That's what criticism does. So you can come to understand how the aesthetic effect is generated, but at least initially, you often don't understand that. Before you do or are given the analysis, the element's effect on you occurs largely below consciousness. There's therefore a question whether, when your appreciation of a work's aesthetic properties is partly subconscious, it has its full aesthetic value, or whether that would be greater if you had a more explicit understanding of how they're produced. If it would have its full value, your coming to that understanding, say through critical analysis, may have the generic value of any knowledge of how something is caused, but no distinctively aesthetic worth. Everything specific to the value of aesthetic appreciation is present in your initial hearing of the larkin as poetic or of the soul music as funky. But it may instead be that the conscious understanding does have aesthetic worth. So what's distinctively valuable in appreciating art is more present if you can see what a work's aesthetic properties rest on or grow out of, than a merely subconscious awareness is incomplete, and critical analysis can make it better. There can, of course, be other benefits to critical analysis. It may be that regular practice in it improves your initial unthinking responses. So the more of it you've done, the more you notice from the start aesthetic features, for example, in poetry or music, that you would otherwise have missed. Through the practice, your subconscious sensitivity is sharpened. I guess somebody might, well, here's a question. Can knowing how a work's features are produced have the opposite effect of undermining the pre-critical aesthetic response? At least often, in my view, that doesn't happen. The larkin still sounds poetic and the soul music still sounds funky after you've learned what makes them so. Or consider the case where a work's theme, say some philosophical idea, is mirrored in its form or in the way that theme is presented. You can't appreciate the organic unity this involves unless you know what the theme is, which much criticism, especially of literary work, aims to identify. So here again, some critical understanding is needed for any aesthetic response to occur. Going back, I mean, those are just kind of sort of additional reasons why critical understanding of works of art can be valuable, because sometimes you can't even have the initial aesthetic response unless you understand something about the elements of the work. Anyways, on the first view described above, where uncritical or subconscious appreciation has full aesthetic value, the aim of government support for the arts need be only to promote such appreciation, say by making concerts and theater performances more affordable. Those attending needn't understand how what they're appreciating is produced. But on the second view, it should also include, as a central component, the promotion of critical understanding and the enriched aesthetic experience that makes for. This can involve explanatory lectures before symphony or theater performances, or free catalogs to accompany exhibitions of paintings. But it may also and primarily be an issue for education. So schools teach students, as they perhaps now do most with literature, to go beyond their initial aesthetic response to a work and reach a fuller, more critical understanding of it. They can then have similarly fuller understandings later in life or more valuable appreciations of the art they encounter. But the goal of arts policy would be not just some, but a more informed or critical appreciation of aesthetic objects. A generality-based view of the kind my earlier lectures defended can supplement this justification of support for the arts with many others. If art conveys knowledge of psychological, philosophical, or other truths, and those are extended and explanatory, that can be a further reason to promote it. This justification is more instrumental, more about what can result from engaging with art than is in the organic unity one about something intrinsic to the engagement. But it can be important if some truths can be communicated best, or even as some have held, can be communicated only through art. Of course, all these justifications have to be weighed against a state's other responsibilities, both to other perfectionist goods and to non-perfectionist concerns, and they'll often be outweighed, but they do have some force, some of which derives, on the view I've presented, from the connection between aesthetic appreciation and mental states with intrinsic and relative generality. Next topic. An equally relevant policy area is education. Here there are both general questions about the overall justification of a public education system and more specific ones about its proper content or the curriculum it should ideally teach. A generality-based perfectionism doesn't propose radically new answers to these questions. On the contrary, it often fits better with much current educational practice than do many non-perfectionist views. Among the many functions of public education, one is to prepare students for work in a modern economy, while another is, by this and other means, to enable them to lead enjoyable adult lives. Neutralist liberals, that's kind of the Rawls Dworkin school, often emphasize how education gives students the tools to autonomously choose a plan of life or to function effectively as democratic citizens. But all these justifications have an at best indirect connection with much of the standard school curriculum, such as the teaching of physics, biology, and abstract mathematics. How much does studying these subjects prepare an average student for paid work or for democratic citizenship? The most obvious thing it does is convey knowledge, sometimes of isolated matters of fact, but often of general principles that make for understanding. And on a generality-based view, this is a central purpose of education, to give students knowledge or a general understanding of the world as an end in itself. On this view, students should learn physics in part because they'll live intrinsically better lives if they know the basic laws governing the motions of objects on Earth and have some grasp of magnetism, electricity, and perhaps particle physics. They should study biology because it's good in itself to understand, say, how the many species in the world today are products of natural selection, and they should have some sense of the way abstract mathematical properties relate. These subjects belong in the curriculum in part because alongside any other benefits, learning them gives students intrinsically valuable because intrinsically and relatively general knowledge. Or consider, just as two more examples, geography and history. Studying these subjects can increase the extent of your knowledge by teaching you truths, especially about other people, that are distant from you in space, time, or both. This can involve intrinsic generality, even when what you know is quite specific, such as some particular fact about ancient Rome. That still takes your mind beyond your own place and time. But there's the most of this value when what you know is itself extended. Thus, from studying geography, you can acquire a mental map of the world as a whole, with its different regions and nations in their respective places. The resultant knowledge is more intrinsically general than if you knew only about your own locale, and it has more determinate content than if you knew only that there are other places in the world, but not how they relate to yours or each other. History likewise gives you knowledge of extended sequences of events in your or another nation's past, now with the temporal and ideally causal relations between them. And these intrinsically general forms of knowledge can lead to better explanations and so to more relative generality. With knowledge of the world as a whole, you can see when events in your nation are the effect of factors that have operated similarly elsewhere. You avoid the parochialism of thinking local effects must have local causes, such as the merits or flaws of your particular government. By applying general principles to your own locale, you can also know, for example, that it's being downwind from mountains explains why your city has limited rainfall. Knowing history can increase your understanding of present-day conditions when they're the result of much earlier ones, and both subjects provide explanations of distant facts, such as about early Rome or present-day Indonesia, in their own local terms. So what you can explain about your place and time is mirrored in what you understand about others. One of my colleagues pointed me to a book of John Dewey's called Democracy and Education, and so it's about education. It has a chapter specifically about geography and history. And it says that studying them, now these are going to be some quotes from Dewey, allows an indefinitely wide scope of intellectual considerations, gives intellectual perspective to what might otherwise be narrow personal actions, and places our doings in their space and time connections. To me, those remarks read as pointing, if somewhat vaguely, to what I've called intrinsic and relative generality, as present in geographical and historical knowledge. These properties are also found in knowledge of physics or biology, if anything to a higher degree because of their more extended subject matter. But geographical and historical knowledge may have a compensating value given a possible addition to the generality account, one that departs a little from pure formality. It says there's added or special value in knowing facts about or related to you, and likewise special value in achieving goals in your life. I think this came up in the question and answer on Wednesday, the idea that there's extra value in self-knowledge and extra value in achieving goals in your life. On this view, there's more value in self-knowledge or understanding your own character than in similarly understanding other people's. There's likewise more value in determining facts about your life, especially large-scale or structural ones, than in similarly affecting other people's. This makes autonomous self-direction not only an instance of achievement, but especially valuable one. And an extension of this view said there's special value in knowing facts about beings that are related to you, including beings in the same species as you. I'm reminded of, the famous Alexander Pope line, the proper study of mankind is man. So the idea is that there's special value in having explanatory knowledge of the human species or other human beings. And so there could be special value in knowing facts about the species you belong to, and by a further extension, about your specific nation or community. These facts all relate in some ways to you, which can give knowing them additional value. But they're also among the central subjects of geography and history, studying which, therefore, can therefore have not only the generic scientific value it shares with learning physics or biology, but also a distinctive humanistic value that comes from thinking about and understanding human beings and human events. So those are intellectual reasons for teaching a subject, and they can be sometimes outweighed by more practical reasons, for example, about preparing students for work. But to me, promoting the intrinsic good of knowledge is at least one important goal of education. In fact, an appeal to this good may provide the best defense of the traditional school curriculum against demands to revise it in ways more thoroughly friendly to business or the economy. I mean, I guess there is that pressure in the world, isn't there, to rejig education to make it better serve the economy. Well, one reason to resist that is a function of education is simply to produce knowledgeable, informed citizens. It doesn't have to be particularly citizens, people who are knowledgeable and informed. And that's the kind of thing that you would favor if you thought that knowledge was one intrinsic and an important intrinsic value. Okay, other parts of the curriculum aim less at explanatory knowledge than at introducing students to activities that can enrich their lives in other ways. Think of classes in art, music, and especially literature. Some students may later practice these arts, painting or playing music, even if only as a hobby, but others may simply read novels or attend the theater. This can have the value promoted by government funding of the arts, but it requires that students first be exposed to art and learn to enjoy it. And it may also, as noted above, require them to start doing critical analysis. Both of these can happen while they're at school. In a book about education, Harry Brighouse argues that schools should mainly introduce students to activities that aren't widely available in the surrounding culture. There's perhaps more these days to classical music than to hip-hop. But the prominence of arts instruction in the standard curriculum is again better explained on a perfectionist basis than the indirect ways neutralists have to invoke. I mean, if you're arguing that schools should teach painting because that will make people better democratic citizens, I think your argument is making a stretch. Just to add, I mean, a lot of student learning happens not in the classroom, but in extracurricular activities. Students play in the school band, work on the yearbook, or join the computer science club. Some of these activities augment classroom teaching for those especially interested in a given subject, think of the computer club, but many offer a further benefit. In my second lecture, I said there's value, initially of intrinsic, but also of relative generality, in activities that involve cooperation with other people, where you intend to make it the case that a larger group, including you, works successfully towards a common goal. And the many extracurricular activities that are group activities embody this value in an especially valuable way. They're usually more structured, involve more participants, and last longer than the more informal collaborations found in children's play. They therefore can involve more generality than such play, as well as doing more to develop the skills for similar collaborations later in life. They instantiate in the present and promote in the future one valuable form of achievement. Now, earlier, just a little while ago, I contrasted promoting students' knowledge as an end in itself with preparing them for paid work. But there can also be a perfectionist justification of the latter if the work in question will have intrinsic value. So the preparation is for something of genuine worth. That will be so if the work is challenging and therefore meaningful, a topic on which a generality-based view again has implications. So this is the next topic, what's called meaningful work. So the work called meaningful is standardly contrasted with the rote or mechanical tasks of an assembly line worker or nowadays a call center employee. Since paid work occupies a great deal of most people's time, its character can have significant effects on the quality of their lives, and it therefore raises important issues of social policy. Here, some philosophers have argued that there's a right to meaningful work, or that justice demands the opportunity for such work for everyone. I mean, among other philosophers, Rawls in his later work affirmed a right to the opportunity for meaningful work. But implicit in these claims is one about value, that meaningful work is a good that can enrich human lives as meaningless work does not. And that claim is best explained, I'll argue, in key respects by perfectionist measures of generality. So, it's possible to value meaningful work on various non-perfectionist grounds, such as that it's enjoyable or something workers want for its own sake. But these grounds are only contingently and therefore unreliably connected to such work's essential features. If people enjoy or prefer meaningless tasks, as the lower orders in Brave New World do, those tasks are best for them. Rawls, who I mentioned, tied the right to the opportunity for meaningful work, which his later work endorsed, to his chief primary good of self-respect, saying the lack of this opportunity is destructive of citizen self-respect. So if you don't have the opportunity for meaningful work, that's destructive of your self-respect. But you can base self-respect on many things other than the quality of your work, and many people do. 20th century assembly line workers weren't, as Rawls' claim suggests, incapable of self-respect. They could and did find self-worth in the fact that they were earning a living and supporting their families. Many also valued the personal qualities of blue-collar workers like themselves, such as camaraderie and honesty and directness, over what they saw as the egotism and fakery of the materially better off. In any case, Rawlsian self-respect involves the belief that your activities are worth doing, and shouldn't it matter whether that belief is true. The better valuing of meaningful work is more direct, based on the objective properties that make it meaningful. And that's the approach that a lot of writers on this topic take, who give at times lengthy lists of such objective properties. But many of the properties, I think if they say meaningful work is work that has a list of properties, objective properties. But many of the properties they cite involve, at bottom, the two forms of generality. Thus, meaningful tasks are characteristically not short-term, like those in assembly line work, but extend through time and have to be intended through time. Think of a defense lawyer's strategy in a criminal trial or a years-long marketing plan in business. They also tend to have a great many constituent parts, again, unlike assembly line work, which makes them more complex and in that way difficult, placing greater demands on attention and executive control. Especially importantly, their parts are usually varied rather than repetitive, which increases their complexity and requires a greater diversity of skills. Thus, the lawyer or marketing executive doesn't do the same thing over and over, but many different things. In particular, meaningful work typically combines a planning phase, where you develop a strategy for your task, and then an executive phase where you carry it out. This distinguishes it from assembly line and other less meaningful work, where you implement a time and motion study or call center script devised by somebody else. And it means your work's having the specific character it does is your rather than somebody else's achievement, reflecting your autonomous choice. That invokes again the idea that there's special value in determining facts about your life, kind of autonomous self-direction. If the work is part of a joint project involving many other people, as it is at a large enterprise, you ideally have at least a rough understanding of how your work fits into that project and can intend what you do, as rote workers often don't, as contributing to that extended end. These are all instantiations within the work of intrinsic and relative generality. In many discussions, meaningful work is said to demand and exercise skill, and while that's in part a consequence of its complexity, it's also, and equally importantly, a matter of what you need in order to do it competently. Someone with no training at a task may have no idea whatever of the means required to complete it, let alone the ability to choose those most likely to succeed. Work that displays that ability involves competence, which is both essential for the full value of achievement and a good in itself. And what distinguishes as a skilled worker's competence from that shown on an assembly line is in part the knowledge it involves, which is more complex, precise, and broadly applicable, so his work has greater cognitive as well as conative value. Moreover, this knowledge and skill must normally be developed through time and practice. Insofar as you aim at that development, your work has another long-term complex goal, that of becoming better at what you do. Several recent books have emphasized how the properties of meaningful work are found not only in the white-collar or professional jobs with which they're most associated, but also in the skilled manual labor of a car mechanic, hairdresser, or a carpenter. Given the formality of its measures, a generality-based perfectionism agrees. Manual work, too, can involve tasks that extend through time and involve varied and interrelated goals. So you need skill first to identify them and then to realize them in the right order. Just some parallels. Just as a doctor needs a unified picture of the whole human body to do her work, so a mechanic has to think of an entire car engine and a carpenter of the whole piece of furniture he's making. A doctor may base a diagnosis on the precise way an organ feels when she palpates it, but a mechanic can likewise tell what's wrong with an engine by the specific sound it makes, and a hairdresser know whether a given style will work for a client by the precise way the client's hair feels between her fingers. The doctor's choices may be more complex than the mechanics or hairdressers, and she may face a greater variety of them. She may also need more elaborate theoretical knowledge. So there may therefore be differences in the degrees of value in the two kinds of work, but both involve broadly similar features of extent and complexity. A generality view doesn't, however, value everything that's been thought to make for meaningful work. In his recent book, Bullshit Jobs, people know that book? No? Yeah. It was kind of talked about. Anyways, in that book, David Graeber takes the jobs that don't merit that title, the ones that are worth doing, to be jobs with, quote, social value, or that provide benefits to other people. He contrasts these with jobs that are socially useless or pernicious. As it happens, many of the bullshit jobs he discusses are meaningless in other ways. Thus, a lot of them don't involve enough tasks to fill the working day, so their occupants chat on Facebook or pretend to be working when they're not. This failing aside, work with Graeber's social value has several obvious merits. It's instrumentally good because of the benefits it gives to others, and also often because providing them is satisfying for the worker. If the benefits are aimed at, it has a more extended goal, and if they're aimed at for their own sakes, it's virtuously motivated. But given their formality, the generality measures don't think Graeber's social value is necessary for meaningful work. Their main concern is the process such work involves, apart from its product, and especially from that product's value. In my second lecture, I said that if you found a company and make it successful, your product may not be significantly better for consumers than your competitors, as Coke isn't significantly better than Pepsi. But ensuring the company's success may be a complex and difficult long-term process, and therefore, on a generality view, a valuable achievement like success in a challenging game. Your employees' work may involve similar achievements, again just as a process and apart from the specific character of its result. I think many business and working people recognize this, relishing what they do in part because of the challenge it poses and the skill it requires. Referring to the account of games by Bernard Suits that I mentioned in my last lecture, an executive at a small IT firm that was given $40 million to grow itself. So this is a quote from a magazine article. This is somebody at a small IT firm, and some venture capitalists give them $40 million and say, you've got so many years to grow the market capitalizations to $1 billion or $5 billion or something like that. And he said, the money served only to, quote, complicate a perfectly pleasant game. It's hard to admit that work is nothing more than a Seussian game. We take our jobs too seriously to admit that jobs are more or less a series of arbitrary obstacles. If we're serious about how we're spending our time alive, we should pick the job that offers the game we most like to play. How am I for time? Can I say something about philosophy? Well, I'm going to tell. So this, Mike Ridge told me of this. Sort of, I think it must be in Mary Midgley's autobiography or memoir. But she had a friend over at her house, and she had an issue of mind lying on the table, and this non-philosopher picked up the issue of mind and was kind of leafing through it and said, these philosophers talk a lot about games. Do they like playing them a lot? That's kind of a 1960s, well, okay. So if you look at philosophy today, isn't there a lot of attention to paradoxes and puzzles? The Sleeping Beauty puzzle, the toxin puzzle, the liar paradox, Newcomb's puzzle. And of course, the official view is that these are deeply revealing of fundamental truths, and we deal with puzzles because they will reveal these underlying truths. Maybe. I think philosophers like puzzles because they're difficult and challenging and interesting. So it's kind of like this IT guy who is happy to be given, how much were they given? $40 million, because now they've got a new interesting challenge. All right. Anyways, this account of meaningful work blurs the distinction between work and play. If work can be defined as any activity engaged in instrumentally in order to earn an income and provide for oneself, play is, at least initially, activity chosen for its own sake or autotelically. But then the two aren't mutually exclusive. A professional athlete can at the same time be playing a sport he loves and earning a salary. Someone doing meaningful work can likewise be both earning her pay and doing something she finds intrinsically rewarding. We can, in fact, imagine two quite different lives of comparable perfectionist worth. In one, you do meaningless work, perhaps on an assembly line, but at high pay and for relatively few hours a week. This gives you leisure time you use for difficult achievement in, say, the arts or sports. In the other life, you have a meaningful job that takes much more of your time and is itself the source of most of your achievement. Though in one case the achievement is found outside work and in the other within it, what makes for achievement in the two is roughly the same. So back to meaningful work. Philosophers and others have proposed various policies to promote meaningful work. One is greater worker involvement in corporate decision-making, for example, through representation on boards of directors. Another is a universal basic income to free workers from the financial pressure to accept meaningless jobs. More radical proposals involve market socialism or socialism more generally. In an ideal discussion, I would now defend one or more of these policies, but the empirical and especially economic issues are too complex for me and especially involve difficult trade-offs. I will, though, venture one suggestion about the broadly free market economies in which most of us live. On the one hand, a market economy can lead, as it often has, to an extreme division of labor and a great many meaningless jobs. That's a clear and serious demerit. On the other hand, and especially in contrast with a planned economy, it gives many people the opportunity for independent entrepreneurship and the doubly general achievement that can involve. Recall the value of starting a company, even just a small one, making all the main decisions about it and seeing it grow. This can otherwise underwrite a distinctive perfectionist defense, or at least a partial defense of the free market, namely that enables many people, and not just a few bureaucrats or planners, to pursue the long-term and multiply interrelated goals of entrepreneurial and other business activity, or gives many people the opportunity for that kind of meaningful work. How far this defense goes depends, of course, on the strength of the market's opposite tendency to create rote or meaningless jobs, and on its other effects, both good and bad, on the quality of people's lives. And those other effects are clearly important. But the defense could be strengthened given certain possible revisions to a market economy. Thus, you can imagine regulations that limit the ability of large corporations to compete against smaller enterprises and drive them out of business, as has happened so often recently in book-selling, restaurants, and many other domains. These regulations might inhibit the largest scale and most impressive business achievements, those of a Ray Kroc or a Jeff Bezos. They might also result in somewhat higher prices for consumers. But these effects might be outweighed by the greater opportunities created for many people to pursue more modest but still valuable entrepreneurial goals. For a generality-based perfectionism, though, more generally, an important question about any economic arrangement is how far it promotes rather than hinders the achievements characteristic of meaningful work for many people. So I'm going to finish by saying, with a discussion of necessity very tentative, of a generality-based perfectionism's implications for economic distribution. Perfectionist views are often thought to favor unequal economic arrangements, as they certainly can if they give great weight to a Nagel-style perfection of humanity view, since then most resources should go to the few who can make new advances, or follow Nietzsche in making society's ultimate goal the excellence of its few most excellent members. But if they value all people's good equally and equate that good with knowledge and especially achievement with the two kinds of generality, they can support a somewhat more a more egalitarian distributive program. At its best, recall, achievement is of a goal that's extended both in time, so it concerns not just the present or immediate future, but also the more distant future and perhaps the past, and in the number of persons it involves, and has many other ideally diverse goals as means to it. So it's also complex. But to pursue this kind of multiply general achievement, you need material security or the confidence that your basic needs won't be frustrated in the near future. Without that, it's hard to look safely beyond the here and now or beyond immediately pressing concerns. In the 1960s, a number of sociologists described what they called a culture of poverty, a set of mental habits found in people facing extreme deprivation and that often prevents them from taking steps that will improve their condition even significantly. At its core is a shortened time horizon, so the extremely poor think mainly of today, not saving for the future, and often buying even food only when they need it, perhaps several times a day. They also tend to be self-centered, so for example, they're quick to resort to violence with little thought for the effects on others. But these narrowings of focus are a natural and even rational response to extreme poverty. If you're not certain you can feed yourself or your family tonight, you can hardly devote yourself to long-term plans. Risking a present loss for the possibility of even substantial future gains is difficult and even irrational. Nor when your survival or minimal comfort is in doubt, is it easy to think altruistically about others. This argument has recently been made by the philosopher Jennifer Morton. For people facing extreme scarcity, she writes, the most urgent problems are short-term and so best dealt with by ignoring longer-term possibilities. But in practical deliberation, we tend to form habits or to follow general norms. And while a norm of short-term thinking is on the whole rational in extreme poverty, it will sometimes lead you not to do what would further a goal you care about, such as not to make a small sacrifice now that could help you lift you out of poverty later. Your precarious situation makes it rational for you to prioritize your own needs now. Intrinsically and relatively general achievement, then, requires a minimal level of material security, and to promote such achievement for all its members, a society should ensure that security for all. This can result from full employment in a productive economy or alternatively from income transfers through a welfare state. Either way, it's inconsistent with the extreme inequality present when some face severe deprivation. And the measure's tendency to favor more equal distribution is strengthened by their formality. Since the two forms of generality can be found in many activities, whatever their content or specific goal, they make great wealth unnecessary for a valuable life. There are indeed worthy achievements that require such wealth, but many don't. While you can pursue a unifying end that involves manipulating vast resources, you can also have one that requires just few. So to have the opportunity for some valuable achievement, resources beyond the minimum matter less and may continue to matter less the more you have. This may be less true of the aspect of intrinsic generality that involves intentionally affecting many people, for example, by managing their work. But though this activity is possible for the private owner of a large corporation, it's also possible for a hired manager who needn't be paid vast amounts, or for a government employee who again doesn't earn extravagantly. The measure's formality also weakens a claim that can tell against equal distribution, namely that there are significant differences in people's natural abilities. If some have more innate talent than others, they can achieve more of worth given a unit of resources, and on that basis should have access to more. But while there certainly are significant differences in people's abilities for specific goods, so some have much more talent for music or chess, the formality of the generality measures makes it less likely that there are similar differences in their overall abilities. The more possibilities there are for valuable achievement, the greater the probability that each person is suited to at least one. though unable to excel in music or chess, he should be able to do meaningful work of some other kind, unify his life around some other goal, or achieve in some leisure pursuit. So the idea is that though there are sort of great benefits to having a minimum of resources, these benefits get less the more resources you have. That's the idea. And that's supposed to be supported by the particular understanding of the value of achievement. I'll just conclude by noting that this isn't a form of argument without historical antecedents. The idea that that's kind of the measure of value of something like achievement is generality, or the unifying of different goals, was actually pretty common in the late 19th and early 20th century. Well, I was going to quote Bradley. So Bradley said, Bradley was one of the people who used a generality test for the significance of knowledge. But he also said, he used a similar test for practical goods like achievement, saying that in action, one goal is, quote, to reduce the raw material of our nature to the highest degree of system. That sounds like relative generality. While another is to widen as far as possible the end to be pursued. That sounds like intrinsic generality. And that was actually a common view among perfectionists of his era, including the new liberal L.T. Hobhouse. So he took the value of a life depends centrally on the unity or harmony of its impulses, which he thought gives you a coherent personality, as a set of unconnected desires does not. So in this period, there's often a valuing of personality, and what personality means something like the unification of desires and goals. And he used these values to defend a broadly egalitarian economic program, including early elements of the welfare state and a tax rate that approached, and perhaps was, 100% on incomes above £5,000. Just to quote him, needs differ in urgency, he wrote, so a certain minimum of material goods is, quote, an absolute necessity, while further additions have less effect, and a law of diminishing returns, this is a quote, applies pretty rigorously to the relations between healthy development and physical conditions. He also denied that there are large differences in people's abilities, saying, quote, a fulfillment or full development of personality is practically possible not for one man only, but for all members of a community. He didn't connect these claims as closely to the specifics of his account of value as I have, but its formality and especially its emphasis through the term personality on what I've called relative generality supports them at several points, making material security crucial if you're to pursue goals beyond your own condition now, and giving many activities value, so great wealth isn't needed for you to have the opportunity for at least one. Now, that kind of argument can't be taken too far. It can't generate a smooth, diminishing marginal utility curve of the kind that people imagine for goods like pleasure or desire fulfillment, but only something rougher and with many exceptions. It also has to allow that there are some differences in people's overall ability. Moreover, its support for equal distributions conflicts with and can be outweighed by considerations based on other intrinsic values or on the demands of economic production. Still, I mean, what I'm suggesting is specific features of the generality measures I proposed for degrees of value in knowledge and achievement, especially for achievement, underwrite a perfectionist argument of some force for some distributive equality. So just to, I guess, to wind up all these lectures, thank you again for listening. Perfectionist values haven't figured much in the recent applied ethics literature. That's partly because many philosophers reject those values or deny, on liberal neutralist grounds, their relevance to public policy. But there's increasing sympathy, I think, for perfectionists, as they're often called, objectivist accounts of the good. But this sympathy often stays fairly abstract, more for objectivism in general than for any specific version of it. And there are many such versions with different substantive claims about value. How any one of them bears on applied questions depends on its particular content or its particular objective goods. So in my first two lectures, I tried to discuss two such goods, knowledge and achievement, both what in general makes them good and what makes for degrees of value in them. This last lecture has used this discussion to derive some, albeit tentative, conclusions about more applied issues. It's tried to move from more abstract descriptions of the two goods to more concrete conclusions about what did I talk about? Government support for the arts, education, meaningful work, and however tentatively, economic distribution. So thank you very much.